The rescue ship cut through the darkness of space like a blade through water, and Commander Thane watched the barren moon grow larger on the viewing screen. Ahead of him, 3 months had passed since the corporate wars tore through the outer reach territories and left dozens of facilities abandoned in their wake, and this particular moon had housed a research outpost that nobody seemed to care about anymore until the distress beacon started transmitting 2 days ago. Thane signaled to his crew and they began their descent, and the moon below them was gray and lifeless with no atmosphere to speak of, and temperatures that could freeze metal solid in minutes, and whatever was down there in that bunker had been alone for a very long time. The landing was rough, and the dust kicked up in strange slow patterns in the low gravity, and Thane led his team of 5 Volcari soldiers across the rocky surface toward the massive reinforced doors that marked the entrance to the underground facility. The doors were sealed tight and showed signs of blast damage and specialist. Cora set up the cutting equipment while the others stood guard and scanned the area, and the whole moon felt dead and forgotten, and Thane wondered what they would find inside. It took 20 minutes to burn through the locks, and when the doors finally groaned open, a wave of stale cold air rushed out and hit them, and the smell was terrible, and it was the smell of waste and decay and something else that Thane could not quite identify. They moved inside with weapons ready and their helmet lights cutting through the darkness, and the facility was larger than expected, with corridors branching off in multiple directions, and everything was covered in a thin layer of frost. The distress beacon was still transmitting from somewhere deep in the bunker, and they followed the signal through winding passages and past laboratories filled with broken equipment and scattered research materials. Then they heard it, and it was a sound that made Thane stop in his tracks and hold up his fist to halt the team. It was whimpering, and it was coming from behind a heavy door at the end of the corridor. Cora moved forward and forced the door open, and they swept into the room with lights blazing. 4 small shapes huddled together in the far corner, and they were cubs, and Valkyrie cubs, and their eyes reflected the light back at the rescue team with fear and confusion. Thane felt his heart skip, and Valkyrie cubs were rare, and these ones looked thin and weak, but they were alive and moving and making those soft, desperate sounds that young ones make when they are scared. Lyra pushed past the soldiers and dropped to her knees in front of the cubs and began scanning them immediately, and her hands were gentle as she checked their vital signs. But then Specialist Cora called out from the other side of the room, and his voice was tight with shock. Thane turned and saw what Cora was pointing at. There was a human lying on the floor near a pile of thermal blankets and empty containers, and the human was male and looked like he had been dead for weeks. His body was skeletal, and his skin was stretched high over his bones, and his face was sunken and gray, and he was covered in scars and burns and looked like he had been through something terrible. The cubs suddenly broke away from Dr. Lyra and scrambled across the floor toward the human, and they climbed onto his chest and started nudging his face with their snouts and making those whimpering sounds again. One of the cubs licked the human face, and another curled up against his neck, and they would not leave him alone. Thane walked over slowly and looked down at the scene, and something about it felt wrong. The human should have been dead, and the cubs should have been terrified of the corpse, but instead they were trying to wake him up like he was just sleeping. Lyra came over with her scanner and ran it over the human body, and her expression changed from curiosity to confusion to complete disbelief. She looked up at Thane, and her voice was barely a whisper when she spoke. There was neural activity and deep in the brainstem, and faint but present, and by every medical standard. The human should have died weeks ago, but somehow some tiny part of him was still holding on. Thane stared at the scanner readings and then back at the human and the cubs, who refused to leave his side. He activated his communicator and called back to the ship and told them to prepare the medical bay immediately, and they had 4 cubs and 1 human, and the human was barely alive, and they needed to move fast. The team worked quickly, and Dr. Lyra sedated the cubs gently because they fought and screamed when the soldiers tried to separate them from the human, and it took 3 of them to carry the cubs to the transport crates while they howled and reached back toward the body on the floor. Thane knelt down beside the human and looked at his face and tried to imagine what had happened here in this frozen bunker and how this man had ended up like this. The human hands were covered in chemical burns, and his fingernails were broken and bloody, and there were marks on his arms that looked like he had been injecting himself with something around the room. Thane could see the evidence of survival, and there were 2 empty ration packs scattered everywhere, and jury-rigged power cables running to the corner where the cubs had been, and a pile of containers that looked like they had held some kind of specialized formula on a broken console nearby. There was a datapad still displaying text, and Thane picked it up and read the last entry. It was dated 47 days after the facility evacuation, and the handwriting was shaky and barely legible. The word said that the cubs would survive for 90 days if the calculations were correct, and the human would make sure of that. Thane looked back at the man on the floor and felt something cold settle in his chest. He signaled to Cora, and they carefully lifted the human body, and it weighed almost nothing, and the bones felt fragile, like they might snap under the slightest pressure. They carried him out of the bunker and across the gray dust of the moon surface and up into the rescue ship where Dr. Lyra was already working on the cubs. As the ship lifted off and left the dead moon behind, Thane stood in the medical bay and watched through the window as Dr. Lyra hooked the human up to every life support system they had. The cubs were in the next room, and even sedated, they kept making sounds and reaching toward the wall that separated them from the human. Thane did not understand what had happened in that bunker, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This human had done something impossible, and the cubs knew it, and they would not forget. The medical bay hummed with activity as Dr. Lyra worked to stabilize the human and keep him from slipping away completely, and every few minutes the alarms would sound and she would adjust something and bring him back from the edge once more. Commander Thane stood outside the window and watched, and he had seen many things in his years of service, but nothing quite like this. The human body was destroying itself, and had been for months, and every organ was failing, and the muscles had been consumed for energy, and even the bone marrow was depleted by every measure known to Volcari medicine. This human should have died 30 days ago at minimum, and yet something kept him going, and something stubborn and unreasonable that refused to quit. In the adjacent room, the 4 cubs were recovering quickly, and they had been bathed and fed and treated for malnutrition and parasites, and they were already moving around and playing with each other. But every few minutes they would stop and look toward the wall and whimper, and Dr. Lyra had to sedate them twice when they became too agitated. Thane left the medical bay and headed to the data analysis room where Specialist Cora was going through the recovered files from the bunker facility. The screen showed personnel records and research logs and security footage, and Cora had been working for 6 hours straight to piece together what happened. Thane sat down, and Cora turned to him with tired eyes and began his report. The facility was a black market research operation and not sanctioned by any legitimate government, and they were doing genetic experiments on rare species, and the cubs were part of a breeding program that was highly illegal. When the corporate wars started, the facility owners decided to evacuate and cut their losses, and they ordered a complete shutdown and personnel extraction. The human was named James Park, and he was hired as a maintenance engineer, and his job was to keep the life support systems running and fix equipment and nothing more. On the day of the evacuation, there was an attack, and explosions ripped through the upper levels and sealed several exits, and James was in the lower section checking on the power grid when it happened. The security footage showed him trying to reach the main hangar, but the path was blocked, and he turned back and found another route, but that one collapsed too, and within 20 minutes, he was trapped. Cora pulled up the footage, and Thane watched as James ran through the corridors, and his face was panicked, and he was shouting into his communicator but getting no response. Then James found the research lab where the cubs were kept, and the door was damaged and hanging open, and inside the 4 cubs were crying and climbing over each other in their containment unit. The footage showed James stop and stare at them, and he stood there for a long moment, and then he checked his communicator again and tried one more time to call for help. Nothing came through, and the facility was already dead to the outside world. And James looked around the lab and then back at the cubs. He made a choice, and Thane could see it happen on the screen, and James walked into the lab and closed the door behind him. What followed was 93 days of the most remarkable thing Thane had ever witnessed. The footage showed James working constantly, and he checked every system and rerouted power away from non-essential areas and focused everything on keeping the lab warm and oxygenated. The cubs needed specialized food, and James found the formula storage and started preparing it according to the instructions on the containers, and he fed them by hand every few hours. In the first week, James ate normally and rationed his own supplies carefully, and he still had hope that a rescue would come by. The second week, his face showed doubt, and he started eating less, and the cubs were growing and needed more food, and James gave them larger portions while his own meals shrank. By the third week, James stopped eating regular food entirely, and Thane watched him prepare the last of his rations and feed it all to the cubs, and then sit against the wall with his head in his hands. The timestamp showed the progression clearly, and every day James grew thinner and moved slower, and his hands shook when he worked, but he never stopped caring for the cubs, and he held them when they cried and played with them when they had energy, and cleaned up after them and kept their area warm. On day 47, the footage showed James sitting at a console and writing something on a datapad, and his hands could barely hold the stylus, and when he was done, he looked at the cubs, and his expression was calm. That was the day he stopped eating completely, and from that point forward, every calorie in the facility went to the cubs. Thing watched James grow weaker and collapse several times and pull himself back up and keep going, and his body was consuming itself, and his eyes were sunken and his skin hung loose. On day 60, James could barely walk, and he crawled across the floor to feed the cubs, and then lay down beside them and let them climb on him for warmth. The temperature had been dropping steadily, and James had rerouted all available power to heating, but it was not enough, and the cubs needed his body heat to survive the cold cycles. The footage showed James lying motionless for hours with the cubs pressed against him, and then forcing himself up to prepare their food, and then collapsing again. On day 75, James spent an entire day crawling to the emergency beacon panel, and it took him 6 hours to reach it and another 3 to activate it because his hands would not work properly. When the beacon was finally transmitting, James crawled back to the cubs and did not move again except to feed them. The final footage was from day 93, and James was lying on the floor, and the cubs were nudging him and crying, and he reached out with one shaking hand and touched each of them, and then his hand fell and did not move again. Cora stopped the playback, and the room was silent. Thane sat back and tried to process what he had seen, and his minds were struggling to understand the logic of it. Any rational being would have eaten the cubs, and it would have been the sensible choice, and James could have survived longer and increased his chances of rescue, but James never even considered it, and Thane could see that in every moment of the footage, and the thought never crossed his mind. Instead, James calculated exactly how long he could keep the cubs alive if he stopped eating, and he chose that path and followed it all the way to the NDR. Lyra voice came through the communicator and pulled Thane from his thoughts. She said that James was stable for now, and his body was responding to treatment, but the damage was severe, and recovery would take months. If he survived at all. Thane stood and looked at the frozen image on the screen, and it showed James lying on the floor with the cubs climbing on him and trying to wake him up. Thought about the 93 days in that bunker, and the choice that James made and the price he paid. And Thane realized that the galaxy had underestimated humans, and perhaps they all had, because what James did was not logical or rational or even sane by most standards, but it was something else entirely, and it was something that made Thane feel small and humbled and uncertain about everything he thought he knew. He left the analysis room and headed back to the medical bay, and he needed to see James again and understand what kind of being could do such a thing. 2 months had passed since the rescue, and James Park opened his eyes for the first time in weeks and stared at the ceiling above him without recognition or understanding. Dr. Lyra was at his side immediately, and her instruments beeped and flashed as she checked his vital signs, and she spoke to him in soft tones and told him he was safe and on a Volcari medical ship. James blinked slowly and tried to speak, but his throat was dry and damaged and no sound came out. The recovery was brutal and painful beyond anything Dr. Lyra had seen before, and the human body had cannibalized itself so completely that regeneration required technology that pushed the limits of what Volcari medicine could do. They had to rebuild his muscle tissue cell by cell and repair the damage to his organs and restore his bone density and flush the toxins that had accumulated in his system. James spent weeks drifting in and out of consciousness, and when he was awake, the pain was constant and sharp, and he would grip the sides of the medical bed until his knuckles turned white. Dr. Lyra tried different pain management protocols, but human physiology was tricky, and what worked for Volcari often had unexpected effects on humans. Through it all, James rarely spoke, and when he did, it was only to ask simple questions about where he was and how long he had been there. Never asked about himself, and never complained about the pain, and never showed any interest in the story that was spreading across the galaxy about what he had done. Commander Thane visited often and sat beside the bed and tried to talk to James about the rescue and the bunker and the choice he made, but James just stared at the ceiling and said nothing, and his eyes were distant and empty. Then one day James turned his head and looked toward the window, and beyond it was the habitat room where the cubs lived. They had grown considerably and were healthy and active and played together under the supervision of 3 Volcari handlers. James watched them for a long time, and something changed in his expression, and a tiny spark of awareness came back to his eyes. After that, James spent all his waking hours looking through the window and tracking the cubs' movements, and his face would soften when they played and tighten when they fought. Dr. Lyra noticed the change and moved his bed closer to the window, and James nodded once in thanks, and that was the motion he had shown since waking up. The cubs seemed to sense him somehow, and they would stop their playing and look toward the medical bay window and pace back and forth, and the handlers could not understand why they were agitated. Thane decided to try something, and he asked Dr. Lyra if James could be moved to the habitat room for a short visit. Dr. Lyra was hesitant and said James was still too weak and his immune system was compromised and the risk was significant, but Thane insisted and said that James needed this, and maybe the cubs did too. They wheeled James into the habitat on a mobile medical bed and kept him separated by a clear barrier at first, and the cubs reacted immediately. All 4 of them rushed to the barrier and pressed against it and made sounds that were somewhere between crying and singing, and their eyes were locked on James. James raised one shaking hand and pressed it against the barrier, and a cub pressed its paw against the other side, and they stayed like that for several minutes. Dr. Lyra watched her scanners and saw James' heart rate increase and his brain activity spike, and tears were running down his face, but he was not making any sound. She made a decision and lowered the barrier, and the cubs rushed forward and climbed onto the bed and surrounded James. They were careful and gentle, and they pressed against him and licked his face and made soft sounds, and James wrapped his arms around them and buried his face in their fur. For the first time since the rescue, James made a sound, and it was something between A laugh and a sob, and his whole body shook with it. The handlers moved to intervene, but Thane held up his hand and stopped them, and they all watched as James held the cubs, and the cubs held him back. After that day, James began to improve faster, and he pushed himself through the painful rehabilitation exercises and forced his body to rebuild and grow stronger. He still did not talk much, but he asked questions now and wanted to know about the cubs and their health and their diet and their behavior. Dr. Lyra answered everything and showed him the reports and explained the care protocols, and James listened carefully and asked intelligent questions that surprised her. 3 months into recovery, James could sit up on his own, and 4 months in he could stand with assistance, and by 5 months he was taking slow, careful steps around the medical bay. The Valkyrie doctors were amazed, and human recovery rates were much faster than they expected, and James pushed himself harder than anyone thought possible. Thane visited one evening and found James standing at the window and watching the cubs, and his reflection in the glass looked thin and tired but alive. Thane stood beside him, and they watched in silence for a while, and then Thane spoke. He told James that the galaxy knew his story now, and the footage from the bunker had been analyzed and shared, and billions of beings across thousands of worlds had seen what he did. He told James that he was being called a hero, and that scholars were studying his actions, and that the cubs he saved were the last of their genetic line and were priceless beyond measure. James said nothing and kept watching the cubs. Thane continued and said that the Valkyrie government wanted to honor him, and that there would be ceremonies and awards and recognition. James finally spoke, and his voice was rough and quiet. He asked where the cubs were going. Thane explained that they would be transferred to a conservation facility, and it was the best in the sector, and they would be cared for by experts and eventually entered into a breeding program to save their species. James was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked if it was a lab. Thane hesitated and said it was a research facility, but also a habitat, and the cubs would have space and enrichment and the best possible care. James turned and looked at Thane directly, and his eyes were hard. He asked if the cubs would be free. Thane did not know how to answer that, and the truth was no, and they would be valuable specimens, and their lives would be controlled and managed and studied. James turned back to the window and spoke again, said he wanted legal guardianship of the cubs. Thane stared at him and thought he had misheard, and he asked James to repeat himself. James said it again, and his voice was steady and clear. He wanted guardianship, and he wanted the cubs to have a choice about their lives, and if anyone had earned that right, it was him. Tried to explain that it was impossible, and humans were not equipped to care for Valkyrie cubs, and the species had specific needs and requirements that James could not meet. James looked at him and said something that Thane would remember for the rest of his life. He said that he already kept them alive for 93 days with nothing but scraps and willpower, and he would do it again and do it better. He said the cubs did not need a lab, and they needed someone who would die for them, and James had already proven he would. Thane left the medical bay, and his minds were spinning, and he knew that James' request would cause problems and complications and legal battles, but he also knew that he could not say no, because James was right, and he had earned something, and the galaxy owed him a debt that could never be repaid. And maybe it was time to try something different and something impossible, just like James had done in that frozen bunker when he chose to save 4 lives at the cost of his own. The courtroom was enormous and filled with representatives from 40 different species, and the case had drawn attention from every corner of the galaxy. James Park sat at the defense table and looked small and fragile next to his Valkyrie legal team, and his body had recovered somewhat, but he would never be the same as he was before the bunker. On the other side of the courtroom sat the prosecutors and representatives from the Galactic Conservation Council and lawyers from the corporation that had owned the research facility. They all wanted the cubs, and they all had reasons and legal arguments and centuries of precedent on their side. The Trial had been going for 3 weeks, and James had sat quietly through all of it and listened to experts debate his fitness and his species limitations and his lifespan and his high span and his emotional stability. They brought in scientists who explained why humans could not possibly care for Valkyrie cubs, and the dietary needs alone were too complex and the social requirements too specific. They brought in psychologists who analyzed the bunker footage and suggested that James had formed an unhealthy attachment and was suffering from trauma, and his judgment was impaired. They brought in conservationists who argued that the cubs were too valuable to risk and their genetics were irreplaceable and they needed to be in a controlled breeding program. The prosecution painted James as well-meaning but ultimately unsuitable, and they acknowledged his sacrifice, but said it did not qualify him for guardianship. Media coverage was constant and intense, and every species had opinions and debates raged across communication networks about human capability and alien rights and the nature of ownership. Some called James a hero and said he deserved anything he asked for, and others called him dangerous and said his emotional attachment would harm the cubs in the long run. Through it all, James said nothing, and his lawyers did most of the talking and presented their arguments about autonomy and rights and the debt owed to someone who gave everything. But the prosecution was winning, and everyone could see it, and the legal precedents were clear, and the cubs would go to the conservation facility, and James would receive honors and compensation, and that would be the end of it. Then on the final day of testimony, James asked to speak. His lawyers were surprised and tried to advise against it, and they said the prosecution would tear him apart and his emotional state would work against him. But James insisted, and the judge allowed it, and James walked slowly to the witness stand and sat down. The lead prosecutor stood and approached, and her name was Council Member Vera, and she was Valkyrie and had been arguing cases for 60 years. She started with simple questions and asked James about his background and his training and his qualifications. James answered honestly and said he was a maintenance engineer and had basic technical skills and no formal education in biology or animal care or conservation. Var asked if he understood the complex dietary needs of Valkyrie cubs, and James said he had learned them in the bunkers. She asked if he understood their social development requirements, and James said he had observed them for 93 days. She asked how long humans typically lived, and James said 70 to 80 years on average. She asked how long Valkyrie lived, and James said he had been told it was over 200 years. Vera smiled and asked James if he understood that he would die long before the cubs reached maturity and who would care for them. Then James said he understood, and that was why he was asking for an independent sanctuary and not just personal custody. Vera pressed harder and asked James if he truly believed he could provide better care than trained professionals with unlimited resources. James was quiet for a moment, and then he said no. The courtroom stirred, and his lawyers looked panicked, and Vera looked satisfied. She asked James to repeat himself, and James said clearly that he could not provide better technical care than the conservation facility. Vera asked then why he was fighting this and wasting everyone's time. James looked directly at her and said because the cubs should have a choice. He said that in the bunker he learned something about them, and they were not just animals or specimens or genetic material. He said they were people, and young and scared and capable of love and trust and grief. He said they understood what he did for them, and they remembered, and they chose to stay with him even when it made no logical sense. Vera argued that this was anthropomorphization and projection, and James was attributing human emotions to beings that did not have them. James shook his head and asked the judge for permission to show something. The judge allowed it, and James pulled up footage on the courtroom display, and it was from the habitat room on the ship. The footage showed the cubs at play, and they were healthy and energetic, and the handlers were nearby. Then James appeared in the doorway, and he was still weak and walking with assistance. The cubs stopped immediately, and all 4 of them rushed to him and surrounded him and pressed against his legs and made sounds and would not leave his side. The handlers tried to redirect them and offered food and toys, and nothing worked. The cubs only wanted James, and they climbed on him carefully and gently like they knew he was fragile. James let the footage play and then showed another clip from a week later. In this one, James was sitting in the habitat and one of the cubs was sick and refusing to eat, and the handlers were worried. James held the cub and talked to it quietly and stroked its fur, and after an hour the cub started eating from his hand. James showed a third clip, and this one was recent. It showed him leaving the habitat to go to a medical appointment, and the cubs became agitated and paced and cried and would not calm down until he returned. James stopped the playback and looked at Vera. He said that he was not claiming to be qualified or capable or even sensible. He said he was claiming that the cubs had made a choice and they had chosen him and he would not abandon them. He said that in the bunker he made a choice too, and he chose to give them everything, even when it meant losing everything. Said the galaxy could debate his qualifications and his fitness and his lifespan all they wanted, but none of them had been in that frozen bunker with 4 starving cubs and 90 days of impossible decisions. None of them had burned through their own body to keep something else alive. None of them had calculated exactly how long they could survive without food so that something else could eat. James' voice was steady and clear, and the courtroom was silent. Said that humans did not save things because it made sense or because they were qualified or because they would get something in return. Humans saved things because they needed saving, and that was enough. He said that every human watching this trial understood what he did and would have done the same thing. He said it was not special or remarkable or heroic by human standards. Was just what you did when something helpless needed you. Vera tried to respond, but James kept talking. He said that the conservation facility would give the cubs safety and food and medical care, and all the technical requirements would be met, but they would be specimens, and their value would be in their genetics, and their lives would be controlled and managed and studied. Said he was offering something different, and a place where they could grow and choose and live as people, and not property. He said he knew he would die before them, and that was why he needed help, and that was why he was asking for an independent sanctuary with oversight and resources and support. But it had to be built on the principle that the cubs had autonomy and rights and the freedom to make their own choices. James finished and sat back and looked exhausted. Courtroom erupted, and species argued with each other, and the media coverage exploded across the galaxy. The judge called for order and said the court would recess for deliberation. James was let out, and his lawyers surrounded him, and they did not know if what he said had helped or hurt. But across the galaxy, billions of beings had watched, and something shifted. Humans shared the footage and rallied support, and other species began to question the conservation model and ask uncomfortable questions about ownership and autonomy. 3 days later, the judge returned with the ruling. The cubs were declared autonomous beings under the protection of an independent sanctuary. James would help establish and oversee it, but it would not be his property. It would be funded by the Velkari government and supported by the Galactic Conservation Council and open to oversight. But its core principle would be autonomy, and the cubs would have choice. The courtroom exploded again, and some celebrated and others protested. James just nodded once and closed his eyes, and for the first time in months, he looked like he could breathe. 5 years had passed since the trial, and the sanctuary world was green and wild, and stretched across 3 continents under a blue sun. James Park stood on a hillside and watched the cubs move through the valley below, and they were not cubs anymore, but fully grown and powerful and beautiful. Sanctuary had taken 2 years to build, and the Volcari government had provided the resources and the planet, and the infrastructure, and species from across the galaxy had contributed knowledge and support. But the design had been James' idea, and every habitat and every structure and every protocol had been built around one principle, and the beings here were People and not property. Commander Thane had resigned his military commission and joined James as co-director, and together they had created something that had never existed before. It was not a zoo, and not a research facility, and not a conservation prison. It was a home where beings could grow and learn and choose their own paths. The 4 original cubs had thrived and grown strong and healthy, and they had explored every corner of their world and learned to hunt and play and exist without cages. Other species have been added over the years, and beings rescued from labs and illegal facilities and corporate experiments, and each one was given the same choice and autonomy and respect. Sanctuary became famous, and visitors came from every system to see what humans and Valkyrie had built together, and many left with new ideas about conservation and ethics. James walked down the hillside, and his body moved slowly and carefully, and the damage from the bunker had never fully healed, and he would always carry the scars, but he was content, and more than he had ever been before. One of the original 4 came to meet him, and her name was River, and she was the largest and had become the leader of her family. Group River bumped against James' shoulder and made a sound deep in her throat, and James scratched behind her ears and smiled. She had 3 cubs of her own now, and they were playing nearby, under the supervision of their father, and James watched them tumble over each other. River had chosen her mate and chosen when to breed and chosen how to raise her young, and those choices were hers alone. That was what made this place different. A transport shuttle descended nearby, and James walked over to meet it, and Thane emerged with a group of scientists from the Galactic Conservation Council. They came every few months to observe and document and report, and at first they had been skeptical and critical, but over time they had become supporters and advocates, and several had even asked to work at the sanctuary permanently. James gave them the standard tour and showed them the habitats and the medical facilities and the observation posts, where beings could watch without interfering. The scientists asked questions and took notes, and one of them asked how the breeding success compared to traditional facilities. Thane answered and said it was higher and significantly higher, and the social structures were more stable, and the offspring were healthier. The scientist seemed surprised and asked why. James said it was simple, and when you gave beings autonomy, they made better choices than anyone could make for them. They chose compatible mates and ideal breeding times and created natural family structures that supported the young. No amount of research and planning could replicate what beings did naturally when given freedom. The scientists wanted to see more data, and James took them to the observation center, where years of information had been collected. The numbers were clear, and the sanctuary model worked better than anyone had predicted, and species that had been declining were now growing and thriving. But more than that, the beings here were happy, and that was something that could not be measured in data, but anyone could see it. As the sun set, James stood on his usual spot on the hillside and watched the families settle in for the night. River and her cubs curled together in a sheltered grove, and other groups found their own spaces across the valley. Thane came and stood beside him, and they had done this many times over the years, and stood together in comfortable silence. Thane spoke first and said that 3 more facilities had contacted them about adopting the sanctuary model. James nodded and said that was good, and it was spreading, and maybe in time the whole approach to conservation would change. Thane asked James if he was satisfied and if this was what he had imagined. James thought about that and said he had not imagined anything in the bunker. He had only thought about the next hour and the next feeding and keeping the cubs alive for one more day. He never thought about after and never thought about this. Thane said that James had changed things, and not just for the cubs, but for the whole galaxy. James shook his head and said he had not changed anything. He said humans had always known this, and any human would have done the same in that bunker. It was the galaxy that was learning and catching up to what humans had always understood, that the value of a life was not in its genetics or its usefulness or its contribution. The Value was simply in existing, and in having the chance to choose and grow and live. Thane was quiet, and then he asked James what he would do when his time came. James knew what he meant, and humans live shorter lives, and James was already feeling the weight of years. He said the sanctuary would continue, and Thane would lead it, and others would come, and the principles would remain, and the cubs he saved would remember, and they would teach their young, and it would spread. Thane asked if James ever regretted it and the choice in the bunker, and the price he paid. James laughed, and it was a real laugh and warm. He said he regretted not bringing more ration packs. Thane did not understand, and James explained. He said that in the bunker he had done the math and calculated everything perfectly, but he had not accounted for how stubborn his body would be, and how long it would cling to life. If he had brought just a few more ration packs, he could have eaten a little longer and made the whole thing easier. That was his only regret. Thane understood then, and felt something in his chest that was respect and wonder and deep affection. They stood together as night fell and watched the stars come out down in the valley. River lifted her head and called out, and her cubs answered, and the sound carried across the hillside. It was a sound of family and safety and choice. It was the sound of beings who were free. James listened and felt something settle in him, and a peace that he had not known. Before the bunker, he had given everything in that frozen facility and had not expected to survive, but he had, and he had used that second chance to build something impossible, a place where beings were people and choices mattered and life had value. Simply because it existed. Years later, when James' time finally came, he was surrounded by 3 generations of the cubs he had saved. River was there, and her children and her children's children, and they pressed close and kept him warm, just like he had kept them warm in the bunker all those years ago. His last words were whispered to River, and he told her to choose and to teach her young to choose. And she understood, because she had always understood. When James died, the cubs sang, and their voices carried across the sanctuary, and every being stopped and listened. It was a song of grief and gratitude and remembrance. It was a song for the strange, fragile human who had given everything. The galaxy heard the song and remembered the story, and humans listened and nodded, because they knew, they had always known, that humanity's greatest strength was not their technology or weapons or intelligence. It was their stubborn, irrational, beautiful refusal to let anything suffer alone, even when it cost them everything, even when it made no sense, even when nobody would ever know. They would give everything to save something helpless, because that was what humans did. That was what made them human, and the galaxy was better for it.